My husband's family looked like the perfect portrait that evening, a glittering facade of unity and elegance under the soft golden lights of my mother-in-law's garden. The party had been planned for weeks, every detail curated to reflect. Her idea of sophistication, crystal glasses chimed with each toast, the tables were draped in ivory linens, and classical music floated in the air as if rehearsed for the occasion. I stood among them, smiling politely, though deep down I knew the cracks in their polished image ran deeper than anyone dared admit. From the outside, it was impossible to tell. Neighbors whispered that his family was impeccable. Colleagues called them influential, and even distant relatives bowed under the illusion that this clan was inseparably close. But as I watched my mother-in-law glide through her party in her jeweled gown, clasping hands and kissing cheeks, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the secret pressing harder against my chest. It was the kind of truth that never stays, buried, the kind of truth that shatters illusions in an instant. And I knew, sooner rather than later, tonight's performance would collapse under its own lies. I remember standing near the garden archway, my glass of champagne untouched, when my husband's sister leaned in, her laughter too loud, too rehearsed. She was always the one who performed the role of the golden child, the one everyone adored, and tonight was no different. Guests praised her sparkling dress, her effortless charm, while I caught the way her eyes darted nervously toward the far corner where her husband hovered, clutching his phone as though it were a lifeline. My father-in-law held court near the fountain, telling the same stories he'd told for years about his business triumphs, stories that had begun to wear thin for anyone who knew the truth. I did. I knew about the financial holes patched up with favors, the investments that weren't investments at all, and the debts hidden like landmines beneath the surface of their perfect lawn. They smiled through it, acting like nothing was wrong, like the entire evening wasn't hanging by a single thread of deception. And my husband, standing a few steps away, smirked that same smirk he wore whenever he thought he was in control. He didn't know that the truth was closer than ever to breaking free, and that when it did, no amount of charm or status would save them. It was only a matter of time. The string lights shimmered above us, casting a warm glow that made everything look softer, almost like a scene from a painting. But the air around me felt brittle, as if the slightest touch would cause it all to splinter. I walked slowly along the edge of the patio, pretending to admire the roses my mother-in-law adored, their perfume heavy in the night air, while inside my chest a storm was tightening. She swept past me at one point, her laughter rich and commanding, a queen in her kingdom. And I wondered how long she had managed to keep this entire performance alive. How many years of whispered lies and silent glances had been required to hold the image together? Because underneath the sparkling dresses, the practiced compliments, the clinking of champagne glasses, there were fractures no one wanted to see. I noticed the way my sister-in-law's diamond bracelet, so proudly displayed, slipped, slightly as her wrist trembled, as if she feared someone might notice it wasn't hers to wear. I caught the sudden hush between my father-in-law and one of his business friends when I walked near, their voices lowering just enough to let me know that their deals were not the pristine successes they were presented to be. And my husband, always so smug, moved from group to group with a casual arrogance, but his eyes flickered every time someone mentioned the company, every time someone hinted at the upcoming audit. The truth was circling them like a predator, invisible to the guests who only saw laughter and silver platters, but visible to me, clear as day, because I had been living in the shadows of their secrets for too long. And I knew the night was not going to end in harmony. The family that looked so united under those glittering lights was already unraveling, thread by thread. And when the first knot slipped free, there would be no stopping the rest. I lingered near the edge of the garden, half hidden behind the ivy-wrapped pillars, my gaze sweeping across the scene like a silent observer of a play I was never truly part of. The violinist's bow slid across the strings in practiced elegance, weaving music that floated between the clinking glasses and forced laughter, but I could hear the cracks beneath it, the discordant notes of a family stretched thin by secrets too heavy to contain. My mother-in-law, radiant in emerald silk, moved through the crowd with her practiced smile, the kind of smile that had fooled countless neighbors and business associates into believing she was the embodiment of grace. Yet I remembered the way. Her voice had trembled last week behind closed doors when she whispered to my husband about keeping everything under control until the party. Control? Such a fragile illusion. My father-in-law stood proudly near the fountain, but I knew his words about legacy and stability were little more than smoke. I had seen the ledgers. I had seen the mounting debts hidden inside accounts, the desperate transfers to cover losses he couldn't admit. And then there was my sister-in-law, twirling her glass of red wine with a laughter too sharp, too brittle. Every now and then, her eyes darted toward the tall figure by the corner. The man she thought no one knew about. But I knew. I had the messages. I had seen her betrayals play out like chapters in a book she thought she kept locked away. And my husband, he played his role best of all. He leaned casually against the marble column, his arm draped with easy confidence, smirking as though the entire evening were his stage. To anyone else, he looked untouchable. But I had lived with that smirk long enough to recognize the fear beneath it, the quick flinch when someone mentioned money, the subtle twitch when the conversation veered toward the future of the company. He didn't know what I knew. None of them did. They thought the masks they wore were flawless, that their sins were buried deep under layers of wealth and polish. But the truth has a way of seeping through even the finest silk. And as I stood there, breathing in the heavy scent of roses, listening to the faint crackle of the lanterns in the breeze, I felt it building. The shift, the unraveling, the moment when everything they had tried to hide would finally claw its way into the open. The perfect family portrait my mother-in-law had curated was about to tear apart at the seams, and when it did, no amount of champagne or string music could stitch it back together. I remember the exact moment the atmosphere shifted. Though no one else seemed to notice it first. It was subtle, like the first faint crack of thunder on a humid night, a warning of the storm crawling closer. The garden was alive with chatter, silver trays of hors d'oeuvres circulating between clusters of guests who congratulated my mother-in-law on another flawless evening. She accepted every compliment with that calculated smile of hers, the one that reached her lips but never her eyes. I sipped at my untouched champagne, letting the bubbles sting my tongue, and studied the scene not as a guest, not as family, but as someone who knew every string holding this performance together. The orchestra of lies had been rehearsed for decades. My father-in-law, with his booming laugh, retold his old story about landing his first $1 million contract, exaggerating details so dramatically that even those who had heard it 100 times before nodded in feigned awe. I caught the flicker in his gaze when his business partner raised a glass, because that partner knew the numbers, the losses hidden behind glossy reports, the desperate phone calls made to keep creditors at bay. He smiled anyway, because exposing the truth here, in front of everyone, would have been too cruel, too dangerous. My sister-in-law drifted by in her sequined gown, draped over her like armor, her every gesture begging for admiration. People whispered about her charm, her poise, her picture-perfect marriage, but I couldn't unsee what I had already discovered. I remembered scrolling through her phone one afternoon when she'd left it unattended on the kitchen counter. Messages that spelled out a life far removed from the loyalty she pretended to embody. She laughed too loudly now, as though noise could drown guilt, as though twirling her glass of wine could hide the shake in her fingers. And then there was my husband. He moved with practiced ease, as though the party was his to command, as though every eye followed him with reverence. He greeted people with his sharp smirk, the same one that once charmed me but had long since turned into a blade pressed against my patience. I watched him closely, every flick of his hand, every shift in his expression, because I knew the truth was hunting him harder than anyone. He could pretend the company was thriving, that his leadership was unshakable, but he couldn't stop the whispers from reaching me. Whispers of accounts being frozen, of investors pulling out, of an audit scheduled sooner than expected. And as I stood there under the glow of lantern light, a realization pressed against me so tightly I could barely breathe. I was the only one holding all of their secrets at once. To them, I was the quiet daughter-in-law, the outsider who smiled politely and blended into the background. But in reality, I was the witness to their entire facade. I saw the way the cracks stretched across every corner of this family, how each lie was woven into the next, forming a net so tangled that one pulled thread could unravel it all. And that thread was already loosening. I didn't have to pull it myself. The truth had a momentum of its own, steady and unstoppable, and it was circling closer by the minute, My mother-in-law's perfect garden party with its laughter and violins and roses in bloom would be remembered not for its elegance but for the moment the illusion shattered. And I knew with a cold certainty that nothing would ever look united again once it did. The moment it began to unravel was so ordinary that most people missed it. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes brushed past my sister-in-law's husband, who had been glued to his phone all night, and in that instant of distraction, the man raised his voice louder than he meant to. It was only a few words, clipped and tense. "I told you it can't wait." But in the delicate hush of curated laughter and string music, it carried further than he realized. Heads turned only for a second before conversations resumed. Yet I noticed my mother-in-law stiffen where she stood. Her eyes, sharp as glass, sliced across the garden to where he stood pale and sweating, his thumb trembling against the glowing screen. She smoothed her expression quickly, raising her chin, returning to her guests. But I saw it. The flinch, the fear. Something was already slipping through her fingers. My father-in-law, meanwhile, tried to pull the crowd tighter to him, his voice booming louder, telling another well-worn story about how he single-handedly saved the company during a crisis years ago. His words spilled over themselves with too much detail, and I saw one of the men listening nod politely while his gaze wandered, bored. That was the thing about lies repeated too often. They lost their power. My sister-in-law caught me watching her, and for a fleeting second, the mask fell. Her smile faltered, her eyes dropped, and then she drained half her wine as if it were water. I remembered the words typed in her secret messages, the confessions, the promises, the admissions of nights spent in places her husband never knew about, and it was like seeing a ghost crawl over her face. The orchestra continued, oblivious, the strings rising and falling, but every note felt like a countdown, every delicate pluck a step closer to collapse. And then my husband, my arrogant, smirking husband, made his mistake. He chose that moment to brag, to pull a group of younger guests closer and tell them how the family business was thriving, how numbers had never been stronger, how expansion was inevitable. He said it loudly, purposefully, so my mother-in-law could hear and smile at his words. But he didn't see the man standing just behind him, the auditor. I recognized him from the discreet meetings I'd stumbled across, the one who had been brought in quietly to review the company's finances. My husband didn't know I had overheard their conversations, hadn't realized I pieced together what was coming. The auditor said nothing, only sipped his drink with calm detachment, but the way his eyes lingered on my husband was enough to send a ripple down my spine. I felt like I was watching a stage where every actor had forgotten their lines, stumbling through the motions, convinced the audience couldn't see the cracks in the performance. But I saw them. I saw everything. My champagne glass was still cold in my hand, but I barely tasted it anymore. My heart pounded with a mix of dread and anticipation because I knew this was the beginning. Not of the end. They were already too far gone for that, but of the exposure, the tearing apart of the illusion they had clung to for so long. And as I looked around that glittering garden, with its roses and lanterns and music that pretended to hold everything together, I realized I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt something colder, sharper, almost exhilarating. The truth wasn't just circling them. It was already here. It was already tearing its way through the fabric of their perfect family portrait, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. The unraveling did not come like a thunderclap, but like a slow, inevitable tide creeping up the shore, swallowing sandcastles built too close to the water. The first wave came when my sister-in-law, flushed from too much wine, dropped her glass onto the marble steps. The shatter rang out sharp and final, slicing through conversation, and for a suspended heartbeat, the party froze. My mother-in-law's face twitched, her perfect mask flickering as she stooped to smooth over the embarrassment, but the silence lingered long enough for people to notice the tremble in her daughter's hands, the sudden wildness in her eyes. Guests whispered, subtle at first, then bolder, leaning toward each other as though sensing blood beneath velvet. My husband moved quickly, placing his arm around his sister, laughing it off as though nothing mattered, but the effort was too loud, too exaggerated. It was the kind of gesture meant to pull attention away, yet it only sharpened the focus. That was when I felt the tension shift, heavier now, crawling across the party like smoke filling a sealed room. The violinist played faster, almost frantically, as though speed could disguise unease, but the music no longer matched the scene. My father-in-law raised his voice again, speaking of stability and future plans, but his words cracked when he realized one of his oldest business associates was no longer smiling politely. The man was staring at him with narrowed eyes, jaw clenched, and I recognized the look. It was the gaze of someone who had waited too long for repayment, who had grown tired of excuses. My mother-in-law swept toward them, her jewels flashing, her smile too wide, and laid a hand on the man's sleeve. For a second, it worked. He softened, bowing his head to her charm, but the damage had been done. Others noticed. Whispers spread again, louder this time, rippling like fire through dry leaves. The illusion was crumbling, and though they tried desperately to keep the edges neat, it was spilling beyond their control. My husband's mistake came next, and it was worse than his sister's slip or his father's faltering tale. He pulled me into his circle, his arm heavy on my shoulder, and announced loudly, "And of course, my wife knows we're stronger than ever. She's seen it herself. Our numbers, our growth. Isn't that right?" His smirk carved across his face like a blade, daring me to contradict him, daring me to play along with the performance. Every eye turned to me in that instant, waiting, watching. I felt the weight of it, the pressure to nod, to confirm, to lie for him as I had been expected to so many times before. But my lips parted, and though I said nothing, the pause was enough. Silence spread, thicker than the music, heavier than the perfume of roses. I could see it in their eyes. Doubt. Doubt in him. Doubt in the entire facade. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need to expose them. They were unraveling themselves, thread by thread, word by word, lie by lie. The truth was no longer a shadow at the edge of the garden. It was here, illuminated under the lanterns, alive in every hushed conversation, every side glance, every broken laugh. My husband shifted uncomfortably, his smirk faltering as the silence deepened, and then he excused himself too quickly, retreating toward the back of the house with his phone clutched in his hand. His sister staggered to the bar for another glass of wine, her mascara smudging in the corners of her eyes. My father-in-law tried to rally the crowd with another toast, raising his glass high, but when his hand shook, the champagne spilled onto his cuff. My mother-in-law, ever the actress, clapped her hands to draw the violinist louder, brighter, but the performance had already collapsed. The guests no longer believed. They no longer admired. They stared, they whispered, and they waited. And I, standing among the ruins of their perfect evening, felt a strange calmness settle over me. I didn't need to force the truth into the open. It was already clawing its way out, unstoppable and merciless. And as the night stretched on, I knew this was only the beginning of their fall. The garden, once glowing with soft golden lanterns and elegant music, began to feel like a stage under interrogation lights. No matter how desperately my mother-in-law moved among the guests with her jeweled smile, the atmosphere had changed. The whispers had grown teeth. People no longer leaned in with admiration. They leaned back, watching, waiting, as though anticipating the inevitable collapse of something they had secretly suspected all along. I stood still, letting the cool evening air brush across my bare shoulders, my untouched champagne warming in my hand, as scene after scene unfolded like carefully scripted acts spiraling out of control. My sister-in-law had retreated into a corner now, her sequined gown no longer gleaming with confidence, but catching the light in jagged fragments that matched the panic on her face. I watched her clutch her phone like a lifeline, her thumbs swiping rapidly, the glow of the screen, exposing messages she desperately tried to hide. I remembered the words I had seen before, the ones that tied her to someone who was not her husband. And in that moment, it was as if I could almost hear them echoing in her head, each one a nail driving into the coffin of her carefully preserved image. Her husband returned to her side, face pale, voice lowered but sharp enough to slice the air between them. Guests nearby pretended not to hear, but their ears strained, their eyes lingered. It was impossible to look away. At the same time, my father-in-law stumbled through another boastful tale, louder now, more insistent, as though volume could compensate for disbelief. He held his glass high, his words tumbling too quickly, and then, fatally, he mentioned a figure. a number that was meant to impress but instead froze the air solid because one of his business associates standing beside him knew the real numbers, the missing zeros, the debts disguised as profits. Their eyes locked, and though no accusation was spoken aloud, the silence that followed carried the weight of revelation. My mother-in-law moved quickly, intercepting, her hand on the associate's sleeve, laughter spilling from her lips like broken glass. But it no longer mattered. The illusion of control was gone. And then, as if fate had been waiting for the exact moment to tighten the noose, my husband reappeared from the shadows near the house. He walked briskly back into the center of the garden, phone still in hand, his smirk weaker now, but not yet erased. He cleared his throat, commanding attention, and announced to everyone that the company had secured major new deals overseas, that expansion was guaranteed, that our family has never been stronger. His words struck like hollow drums, because directly behind him, unnoticed by him until it was too late, stood the auditor. The man who had been quietly observing all evening, who now finally stepped into the light with a presence that silenced even the violins. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His calm nod toward a colleague across the garden followed. By the appearance of two additional men in dark suits, said more than words ever could. My husband froze mid-sentence, his phone still raised like a shield, his smirk evaporating in real time as if the muscles of his face had forgotten how to hold it. The guests gasped, some covering their mouths, others whispering louder now, no longer caring to hide it. My mother-in-law rushed forward, her jeweled gown sweeping across the stones, her voice dripping with fury wrapped in sweetness. This is highly inappropriate. This is a family celebration. But the men in suits did not flinch. They were not there for her. They were there for the truth. And the truth had finally arrived. My sister-in-law's phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the stones. My father-in-law's glass shattered when it hit the fountain's edge. And my husband, once the golden sun who smirked as though the world bowed to him, stood pale and trembling, his arrogance stripped away like paint washed off by rain. The garden was silent now, except for the faint rustle of roses in the wind, and in that silence, the facade his family had clung to for decades disintegrated before everyone's eyes. And I, standing in the middle of it all, felt no urge to speak, no desire to intervene. I had waited too long, carried too many of their secrets, endured too many of their demands for silence. Now I could simply watch as the truth, relentless and merciless, tore them apart in the very place they had tried to shine brightest. It was not me who exposed them. It was their own lies, collapsing under the weight of their greed and deceit. And as their empire of glass shattered in the glow of the lanterns, I realized that for the first time, I was free. The silence that followed was not the peaceful kind, not the gentle hush of a party winding down. It was jagged, electric, the kind of silence that prickled across skin and made every breath sound too loud, too guilty. Guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting from one family member to the next, waiting for someone to speak, waiting for the show to continue. But the show was over. My mother-in-law's jeweled hand still clutched at the auditor's sleeve, her painted smile stretched so tightly it looked painful. "Surely there must be some misunderstanding," she purred, but her voice wavered, and the men in suits did, not so much as blink. Her control, once absolute, now cracked audibly with every syllable. My father-in-law tried to rally, puffing his chest, his voice booming with manufactured outrage, but when he reached into his pocket for a cigar, his little ritual of dominance, his hands trembled so violently that he dropped it onto the stones. It rolled pathetically into the fountain's edge. The crowd didn't laugh, but they noticed. They noticed everything. My sister-in-law, standing frozen by the bar, bent slowly to retrieve her fallen phone. Her hair had slipped from its perfect waves, strands sticking to her damp temples, and I could see her lips moving silently, forming words to no one. Pleas, prayers, curses, I couldn't tell. Her husband stood rigid beside her, fists clenched, eyes blazing with something dark. For years they had played the perfect couple, dazzling friends with their vacations, their smiles, their staged moments of affection. But here, under the lantern light, the mask had slipped beyond repair. His glare was not at her phone, but at her. He had seen enough. maybe even more than I had guessed. And now, in front of the entire garden, their marriage fractured like glass under pressure. My husband, though, he was the one who drew every gaze. He stood at the center of it all, his phone still clutched in his palm. But for once, his smirk was gone. His face was ashen, his lips parted slightly, as though he had forgotten how to breathe. He opened his mouth to speak, to charm, to lie his way out as he always had, but the auditor spoke first, calmly, firmly, in a voice that sliced through the charged night. "The documents don't lie." That was all he said. 4 words, and it was enough. Guests gasped, some openly now, some turning away to murmur behind raised hands. My husband's shoulders sagged as though someone had driven a stake through his chest. He tried to laugh, to shake his head, but the sound that came out was hollow, humorless, like a man already buried. My mother-in-law hissed his name under, her breath, her fury barely contained, but even she knew this was beyond her control. The men in suits moved closer, not aggressively, not even quickly, but with the certainty of people who had waited long enough. The image of unity, of a powerful, untouchable family, lay shattered across the marble like the broken wineglass from earlier. The violinist stopped playing, his bow hanging uselessly midair, as though even the music refused to accompany what was unfolding. And me? I stood at the edge of the chaos, my hands steady, my breath calm, watching the dynasty that had lorded over me for years collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Every betrayal, every lie, every smug smirk and silencing glance, they were all coming home to roost tonight. I remembered the nights I had been told to stay quiet, to support the family, to nod and smile even when my own dignity was bleeding. I remembered every moment of isolation, every humiliation disguised as a lesson, every time I was made to feel less. And now, as the crowd turned away from them, disgusted and eager for gossip, I felt something unfamiliar, something liberating, relief. Not triumph, not vengeance, just release. I had not lifted a finger, had not spoken a single word to cause this downfall. They had destroyed themselves, undone by the lies they polished and paraded like jewels. My husband caught my eye. Then, his face crumbling, silently pleading for me to stand with him, to salvage his pride, to lie one more time for the sake of appearance. But I didn't move. I didn't blink. I let him see it in my gaze. I was done carrying the weight of his family's sins. And in that moment, under the lanterns that had once made this garden feel like a crown jewel, his shoulders sank completely, his defeat etched into the night. The truth had torn them apart, and it was merciless, and it was just. And I knew this was only the beginning. The night stretched on, but it no longer resembled a celebration. It resembled a reckoning. The garden that had been staged like a royal court now looked like the aftermath of a play where all the actors had forgotten their roles, left stumbling in costumes too heavy to carry. The guests, once charmed and entertained, now formed small, murmuring clusters. Some whispered in disbelief, others exchanged knowing glances, as though they had always suspected the rot beneath the glitter. The scent of roses, once intoxicating, now hung heavy and almost sickly, like perfume trying to mask decay. My mother-in-law, desperate to salvage control, clapped her hands sharply and called for attention, her voice slicing through the low tide of whispers. "Enough of this nonsense," she declared, her jeweled gown shimmering under the lanterns. But the shimmer looked gaudy now, hollow. "This is my home, this is my family, and we will not be disrespected." Her words echoed with authority. But authority only works when people believe in it, and tonight, no one did, not even her husband. He stood behind her, shoulders hunched, his face drawn and gray, as if years of secrets had finally settled onto his bones. The mighty patriarch, reduced to a weary old man before the eyes of those who once admired him. My sister-in-law tried to slip away then, heels clicking against the stone, but her husband caught her wrist. The grip was not gentle. Their eyes locked in a silent war, her face blotched with panic, his jaw tight with fury. Guests looked away, pretending not to notice, but the scene etched itself into every memory present. The illusion of their perfect marriage was gone forever. My husband, though, remained at the center, as though nailed to the marble floor. His phone hung useless at his side, his other hand trembling against his jacket pocket. He searched the crowd, his eyes frantic, looking for an ally, someone to vouch for him, someone to confirm his story of strength and growth, but no one moved. Not a single guest stepped forward. Even those who had benefited from his family's wealth kept their distance now, unwilling to be dragged into the collapse. And then, inevitably, his eyes found mine. He stared at me with that silent plea, the unspoken demand I had seen 100 times before. Stand beside me. Fix this. Lie for me one more time. It was the same look he had given me in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in family dinners where his arrogance had drawn suspicion. And always, I had obeyed. Always, I had covered, smoothed, silenced myself to preserve his image. But not tonight. Tonight, I simply looked back at him, my expression calm, my silence louder than any words. And in that silence, he understood. His smirk, his weapon, his shield, it was gone. His face sagged, eyes hollow, as though he had aged 10 years in the span of a minute. My mother-in-law noticed it too, and for the first time, her fury turned on me. She crossed the distance between us in a sweep of emerald silk, her voice low, venomous, just for me. You think you're better than us? You think you'll survive without this family? Her nails grazed my arm as she leaned closer, her eyes burning with the fire of someone who had built her life on control. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I already have, I whispered, and it was the truth. She recoiled, as though my words had burned her skin. Around us, the garden was unraveling faster now. The auditor conferred quietly with his colleagues, their calm presence heavier than any shouted accusation. My father-in-law sat down abruptly on the fountain's edge, his glassy eyes fixed on the ground as though he could no longer bear the weight of standing. My sister-in-law's husband finally released her wrist, but not before spitting words into her ear that made her shoulders quake. And my husband... He looked like a man staring into a mirror for the first time, seeing not charm, not power, not brilliance, but the hollow shell beneath it all. The guests began to leave then, slowly at first, then in a steady stream. Polite excuses were murmured. Long drive, early morning. But everyone knew the truth. They weren't leaving because the night was over. They were leaving because the family was finished. No one wanted to be caught holding a candle for a dynasty already reduced to ashes. Lanterns still glowed, roses still bloomed, violins still rested on their stands. But the magic was gone. The only thing left was the truth, raw and unvarnished, hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. And in that truth, I stood taller than I ever had before. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing down on me, no chains of loyalty binding me to their performance. They had always believed I was a background player, a silent figure in their perfect tableau. But as their empire crumbled in front of everyone, it was me who remained unbroken, untouched. And I knew, with a clarity sharper than any diamond on my mother-in-law's hand, that this was not just the end of their illusion. It was the beginning of my freedom. The garden emptied piece by piece, like a theater after a disastrous performance, where the audience no longer bothers to clap. The polished image of my husband's family had dissolved into fragments of shame scattered across the marble floor, and the people who once clung to their name now turned their backs with murmured disdain. My mother-in-law stood at the center of it all, her gown glittering in the lantern light like a costume worn past its time, her face tight with rage and desperation. She barked orders at the servants, told them to play music, bring more wine, make the guests stay, but no one obeyed. Even the staff, loyal for years out of fear or money, drifted away quietly, unwilling to be part of the wreckage. My father-in-law had not moved from the fountain's edge. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed, the image of a man who finally realized the empire he boasted about for decades was nothing more than sand slipping through his fingers. My sister-in-law, disheveled now, mascara streaking down her cheeks, tried to argue with her husband in a corner, but their voices rose too loud, their accusations spilling into the open for anyone still present to hear. Words like affair, lies, and ruined tore the air apart, each syllable a nail in the coffin of their performance. And my husband, the one who had smirked at me countless times, stood near the house as though the walls themselves might swallow him whole. His phone lay abandoned on the table, his eyes wild, his confidence shattered. He looked at me one last time, not with arrogance, not with fury, but with a kind of hollow emptiness. The gaze of a man who finally understood he had nothing left to wield against me. The truth had stripped him bare, left him smaller than I had ever seen. Guests' cars pulled away down the long driveway, headlights vanishing one by one, until the garden was filled only with the soft hiss of the wind and the distant hum of insects. The night no longer felt golden. It felt raw, exposed, like a wound no silk or music could conceal. And in that raw silence, I realized this was the moment I had been waiting for. Not revenge through action, not through words, but through witnessing. I had survived their games, their cruelty, their demand for my silence. And now I stood whole while they unraveled, powerless to stop the tide. They had wanted to look united. They had wanted to look untouchable. But the truth had done what I never needed to. It tore them apart. The garden was almost empty by the time I finally set my glass down. The lanterns still glowed faintly, their warm light trembling against the cool night air. But they no longer felt celebratory. They felt like remnants of a battle no one won, flickering over the ruins of what once pretended to be a kingdom. The roses leaned heavily against their stems, petals sagging under the weight of the evening dew, and even they seemed exhausted by the performance that had taken place here. My mother-in-law still stood tall, or at least she tried to. Her gown sparkled defiantly, her posture rigid, her eyes darting from the fountain where her husband sat, collapsed to the corner where her daughter's marriage cracked audibly in front of anyone who cared to listen. She still tried to issue commands, her voice sharp, brittle, but the power behind it had evaporated. No one obeyed, not even her children. My father-in-law remained frozen on the fountain's edge, staring blankly into the water, his reflection rippling under the faint moonlight. He had built his life on the myth of stability, on the illusion that money could insulate him from decay. And now, stripped of it all, he looked not like a patriarch, but like a man who had finally been forced to face himself. His cigar had gone, out long ago, forgotten where it had fallen, a fitting symbol of everything he had lost. My sister-in-law's laughter, once too bright and too rehearsed, had turned into sobs muffled against her sleeve. Her husband had stormed away after spitting venom that left her trembling, and now she stood alone, mascara streaked down her cheeks, her sequined gown slipping from one shoulder as though even her clothes no longer wanted to hold her together. I thought of the messages I had seen on her phone, the secrets she thought she had buried. It wasn't me who exposed her tonight. It was her own arrogance, her own choices, unspooling in front of everyone until there was no pretending left. And then there was my husband. He had drifted to the edge of the house, leaning heavily against the stone wall, his face pale in the lantern light. For years, he had smirked his way through every situation, wielding arrogance like a sword, using me as a shield when his lies needed covering. For years, he had looked at me as though I were a pawn, something to maneuver in his family's endless performance of power. But tonight he looked at me differently. Not as an ally, not as an enemy, but as a mirror. Because when he met my eyes, he saw the truth reflected back at him. There was nothing left to smirk about. His empire was gone, his family's reputation in ruins, his image shattered beyond repair, and I would not save him. Not now, not ever, again. He mouthed my name once, barely a whisper, but I did not move. I simply stood there, calm, steady, letting the weight of my silence crush him more thoroughly than any shouted accusation ever could. Cars had stopped pulling away now. The driveway was quiet, empty. The last of the guests had fled, unwilling to remain witnesses to a spectacle turned tragedy. The violinist had packed up his bow. The waiters had slipped out the back gates. Even the servants had disappeared into the night. The garden that had been so carefully staged now lay deserted, filled only with fragments. Broken glass, spilled wine staining the marble, petals crushed under careless footsteps. It looked like a battlefield. And perhaps that's exactly what it was. A battlefield where the weapons were lies, where the casualties were reputations, and where the truth itself was the victor. I walked slowly across the stones, past the fountain where my father-in-law sat, past my sister-in-law trembling alone, past my mother-in-law clutching at her fading dignity. None of them stopped me. None of them spoke. Perhaps they knew there was nothing they could say to me anymore, nothing that could rewrite what had unfolded before my eyes. When I reached the edge of the garden, I paused for one final glance. The family that had once stood so united in their arrogance now stood apart, broken fragments of the illusion they had forced the world to believe. They were no longer powerful, no longer enviable. They were simply human, exposed, trembling, undone. And me? I was free. Free from their manipulations, free from their demands for my silence, free from the endless expectation to protect their image while they destroyed mine. I had endured their cruelty, survived their games, and tonight I watched as the truth finished what I had never dared to start. I stepped beyond the lantern light then, into the cool darkness of the night, the sound of my heels echoing against the stone path. Each step felt lighter than the last, as though the chains I had carried for years were falling away, link by link, dissolving into the shadows. Behind me, the house still glowed, but it was no longer a palace. It was a cage they had built for themselves, a gilded prison that would now forever remind them of the night everything fell apart. I did not look back again. I did not need to. Their empire had crumbled, their secrets lay bare, and their downfall was complete. For the first time in years, I belonged to no one but myself. For the first time in years, I could breathe without fear. And as the night sky opened above me, vast and endless, I realized something with bone-deep certainty. Revenge had never required me to lift a hand. It had only required patience, because the greatest revenge was never in striking back. It was in watching them destroy themselves while I walked away whole. And that, I thought, as the cool wind brushed my face and the garden vanished behind me, was exactly what I had done.